Maylands Historical and Peninsula Association are proud to be sponsored by some of our local businesses. NTY, our established local real estate agent. Rufo's, for great coffee and great pizzas. Esteban's, offering you hairdressing excellence. Clinicare, for all your pharmacy needs. Rubble Books and Games, a family-run bookstore. Lyric Lane, for good food, drink and music. Mastengo, suppliers of non-preservative wine. Maylands Park Shopping Centre, offering you mall-style shopping in Maylands. These local businesses support us. We think they deserve your support.
Good evening, everyone. Nice to be here. Nice that you're able to come out. I hope you're going to enjoy tonight's presentation. I've had fun putting it together. I've given it a few times before. So let's start the journey. So welcome to this talk on history before 1829. First, I wish to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people being the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on, and I recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, culture and the community in which we are now fortunate to live. Most of the history we see and read in Perth is from 1829, when the British founded a colony. As to the history before 1829, this is the topic of my talk, being in three parts. First, ancient Australia from about 4.4 billion years ago. Second, Aborigines from about 65,000 years ago. And third, boat arrivals from at least 223 years before 1829. So here we go. We begin our journey about 4.4 billion years ago when the Earth was still forming. About a 13-hour drive, 800 kilometres north of Perth, is Jack Hills, a place where zircon can be found, being evidence of the oldest material of our planet. At that time, Australia had an unknown name, a different shape, and was in a different geographical location. Fast forwarding almost a billion years, we next go to the coast at Shark Bay and Lake Clifton, where today we can see stromatolites and thrombolites, similar to those which about 3.5 billion years ago were starting to harness the power of sunlight to produce oxygen. About 2.5 billion years ago, thanks to oxygen now in the atmosphere, the iron in the oceans began rusting, with layer after layer of red ooze settling onto the sea floor. The massive iron ore deposits of the Pilbara, such as those near Newman, are the direct economic legacy of the rusting of the oceans, which took place over about 2,000 million years. To better understand the dramatic changes in climate that have impacted most forms of life, we need to be aware of three astronomical cycles which were discovered in the 1920s by Milutin Milankovitch. First, a 100,000-year cycle where the Earth orbits the Sun from an elliptical to a near circular orbit. Second, a 41,000-year cycle based on the Earth's changing tilt. The tilt thought to be due to a collision about 4.5 billion years ago with the Earth and a body the size of Mars, resulting in our Moon. It is thanks to the tilt that the Earth has its 4 seasons. And third, a 25,800-year cycle based on the Earth's wobble. The three cycles strongly influence our planet's climatic patterns. It's due to the three cycles that the Earth has experienced 5 major ice ages, with the last glacial period lasting from about 110,000 to 11,700 years ago. The next ice age could start in less than 100,000 years, or perhaps much longer, depending on levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide and impact on global warming. In the second major ice age, from 850 to 635 million years ago, life was almost halted by global glaciation. Due to plate tectonics, furious volcanic eruptions primed the atmosphere with greenhouse gases, causing the Great Snowball to be followed by the Great Thaw. Thereafter, life began to flourish. 635 to 542 million years ago, in once shallow waters, lived some of the oldest multicellular animals, as evidenced in the photo of the fossil Dickensodia found near Ediacara in the Flinders Ranges in South Australia. About 550 to 500 million years ago, due to shifts in tectonic plates, the great landmass known as Gondwana land was formed, of which Australia was a part. It was during this time that titanic tectonic forces caused the Earth to buckle to form inland mountain ranges in central Australia, thought to be not one, but several kilometres high. Sands from the eroded mountains were washed away to settle at the edge of a now vanished sea. The wet iron mineral sands solidified and rusted to become Uluru or Ayers Rock. Given large swings in climate caused by the three Milankovitch cycles, as shown by the graph, sea levels for the past 542 million years are estimated to have fluctuated from being more than 200 metres above to being more than 100 metres below where they are today. From 480 to 460 million years ago, seawater flooded across the centre of Australia to form the Larapinta Seaway, which today is the Simpson Desert. Dating from this time, found in Alice Springs are fossil remains of our very distant ancestor, Arandaspus priontolepus, the world's earliest known fish which, although it had no fins, it importantly had a backbone. Over 400 million years ago, as evidenced by tracks found in rock along the Murchison River at Kalbarri, animals such as giant sea scorpions started coming ashore. The tracks here are thought to be the oldest evidence of animals on land. Still in WA, we now go to the Kimberley, where more than 350 million years ago, a large ancient tropical reef extended for up to 1,000 kilometres. Some here may have visited Windjana Gorge, being about 150 kilometres inland from today's coastal town of Derby, or is it Derby, where remnants of the reef can be found in marine fossils. Nearby in this era, sands and gravels from ancient mountains started arriving by rivers in the area known as Purnalulu, or the Bungle Bungles. Many are familiar with the beehive appearance of these ranges, being evidence of the process of worn strata layers of sediment of ancient riverbeds. Emerging life was cut short when about 250 million years ago, a massive volcanic eruption occurred in Siberia, which pushed carbon dioxide levels sky high, causing a runaway greenhouse crisis. And in a blink, the end for between 80 and 95% of all species on the planet. About 184 million years ago, Gondwana land started breaking up. About 120 million years ago, ocean levels rose over 200 metres above today's levels, with water flooding into central Australia to become the Erromonga Sea. The ancient sea was full of marine life, including nautiloids on the top right, larger than tractor tyres and growing up to 10 metres in length. Also plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, whose fossils have been found at numerous locations, including at Kalbarri, now on display at the Geraldton Museum. This month, I visited Coopapedy, the shores of an ancient sea where fossils of marine creatures including calamari, gastropods, plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs have been found. I also visited the South Australian Museum, where on display is said to be the finest known opalised skeleton on Earth, being of a plesiosaur that swam in the icy seas of inland Australia 110 million years ago. As shown by fossil remains now at the Queensland Museum, the top marine predator was the plesiosaur Kronosaurus, the bottom right, who had long, sharp, conical teeth exceeding 7 centimetres, and whose body length was around 9 to 10 metres. Today's sharks and crocodiles would have been just a snack for plesiosaur Kronosaurus. Here are a couple of photos I took on the 11th of March at the South Australian Museum of the amazing display of the opalised plesiosaur skeleton, discovered in 1968 from the Andamuka opal fields. It's described as a national treasure. At this point, I draw your attention to the amazing Perth Canyon. More than 100 million years old, it was carved as an extension of the Swan River, when this part of the continental shelf was above sea level. Starting about 22 kilometres west of Rottnest Island, with a length of 220 kilometres, an average width of 15 kilometres, and depths up to 4 kilometres, this underwater canyon is comparable in size to the Grand Canyon in Arizona. Due to Antarctic currents, this is a nutrient-rich environment for corals, marine life, and a good feeding ground for pygmy blue whales. Now we are in the era of the dinosaurs who distinctly left their mark across Australia. Evidence of footprints can be found near Broome, where numerous types of dinosaurs, such as sauropod and stegosaur, walked along the Kimberley coast more than 115 million years ago. Another example of many is at Erramonga in Queensland, where very large bones, up to 98 million years old, have been found of dinosaurs thought to have weighed up to 100 tonnes. About 142 million years ago, a meteor slammed into Central Australia to create the 20-kilometre wide crater at Goss's Bluff in the Northern Territory, in the top left. This was a portent of dangers to come. About 66 million years ago, a much larger meteor slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, leaving a crater more than 180 kilometres in diameter. With the world thrown into an extended darkness which shut down life-giving photosynthesis, 75% of plant and animal species suddenly became extinct, including the dinosaurs. About 80 million years ago, Australia began to separate from Antarctica. Cold motion currents were able to sweep freely around Antarctica to seal its icy fate and lock up much of the planet's water. The splitting of Antarctica and Australia is reflected in the landscape of Tasmania, which features columns of dolerite, when vast quantities of molten rock were pushed up from deep in the earth through weak points in the Earth's crust. After about 30 to 40 million years ago, as Australia started drifting north at the breakneck speed of about 12 centimetres per year, it dried, leaving Australian animals and plants to take on their unique Antipodean identities. About 15 million years ago, the extensive rainforests began their long retreat, to be often replaced with grass extending over vast areas. To take advantage of these great distances, kangaroos, with their unique hopping ability, evolved from tree-dwelling possums. Then about 5 million years ago, the deserts began to finally claim Central Australia, the land of which we are more familiar. Before we move on to the history of Aborigines and boat arrivals, it's worth reflecting on the story of life so far, with two competing views. On the one hand, there is the story of creation, which, as announced in 1658 by Bishop James Ussher, took just 6 days to occur, apparently in October, back in 4004 BC. Alternatively, there is the story of the growing evolutionary tree of all life, where the last universal common ancestor for all plants and animals came into being about 3.5 to 3.8 billion years ago. A tiny bundle of genetic material passed from one living entity to another and has never stopped moving. We are, in fact, all related, a point worth remembering when too often we focus on differences that divide rather than a common ancestry which should unite us. The number of species since life began is believed to be about 30 billion, but could be as high as 4,000 billion. Whatever the actual total, due to 5 major extinction episodes, scientists believe that 99.99% of all species that have ever lived are no longer with us. If the Earth began 24 hours ago, just after 3 a.m. chemicals fidgeted to life. More than 16 hours later, multicellular organisms appeared. At about 9:30 p.m, jawless fish evolved, followed by insects just before 10 p.m. Dinosaurs from about 10:48 p.m, and mammals just before 11 p.m. Modern humans appeared less than a minute to midnight, being no more than 0.0001% of Earth's history. Yes, it's all quite amazing. Early human history started with apes. It's believed by most scientists to have begun in Africa between 5 to 9 million years ago. While some date estimates vary, as shown on the map of the migration of anatomically modern humans, evidence from fossils, ancient artefacts and genetic analysis has given a good idea of when humans have migrated across the world. Following the discovery in 2002 of an ancient human jawbone found at the Mislia cave in Israel, it's believed modern humans were coming out of Africa at least 180,000 years ago. During the last ice age, from about 110,000 to 11,700 years ago, as the ice sheets grew and sea levels dropped, this allowed early humans to migrate into northern Europe, as well as an easterly and southerly route which took them to Australia. Whilst there are other theories, arrival by humans in Australia is now thought to be about 65,000 years ago. Evidence of humans reaching Australia 650 centuries ago has recently been found at Mudgebebi in the Northern Territory. Using a combination of radiocarbon and luminescence dating, finds at the rock shelter have revealed one of the most significant cultural and archaeological sites in the world. Artefacts found include the world's oldest known ground edge axe head, the oldest known grinding stone, and the world's oldest known use of early paints. Another site of Aboriginal occupation is a Booty Cave on Barrow Island, where archaeologist Professor Peter Veth from the University of Western Australia has led an international team of 30 scientists who have discovered evidence for Aboriginal occupation between 511 and 462 centuries ago, when sea levels were about 50 metres below present-day levels. Also around this time of 45 to 50,000 years ago are discoveries of Aboriginal occupation at Devil's Lair Cave in WA and Lake Mungo in New South Wales. About 20,000 years ago, sea levels dropped to 120 metres below present-day levels. With these low sea levels, Australia was part of the land continent called Sahul, which included New Guinea, thus facilitating human migration from the northwest. About 10,000 BC, rising sea levels formed Bass Strait and separated Tasmania. After about 8,000 BC, the lowlands in the north were flooded by the sea, creating Torres Strait and separating New Guinea from Australia. Facing early Aborigines would have been a frightening array of new large animals, or megafauna, including Megalania, a giant goanna, estimated to grow up to a length of 7 metres. Evidence of these large ancient animals can be found at the Narracourt Caves in South Australia, which contain fossil deposits for around 120 species of vertebrate animals, stretching back 500,000 years, including the remains of Diprotodon, a giant wombat weighing around 2.5 tonnes, Procoptodon, the largest kangaroos of all time standing more than 2 metres high, and Thylacoleo carnifex, a marsupial lion about 1.5 metres long with massive jaws and teeth. Remains of this lion have also been found in the Mammoth Cave in WA's Margaret River region. During the last ice age, sea levels plunged to more than 122 metres below present. With the end of the ice age starting from about 18,000 years ago, sea levels started rising and stopped about 6,700 years ago. For the Aborigines, this period of time was known as the Great Flood. This might correspond with the biblical story of Noah and his ark. In a scene portrayed in the very highly recommended program Australia the Time Traveller's Guide, it's interesting to see the picture of Sydney Harbour, top right, it's a bit hard to see, sorry for up the back, as a valley before being inundated by the rising sea. With rising sea levels, the 18-kilometre land bridge between Fremantle and Rottnest Island submerged underwater about 7,000 years ago. Found on Rottnest, known by Noongars as Wadjamup, are human artefacts believed to be up to 50,000 years old. The artefacts are pieces of fossilised chert or flaked rock with sharp edges, which evidence tool making there up to 500 centuries ago. Many years ago, I read a book by Caroline Jones, who mentioned her shock when she saw this map of Indigenous Australia. This was not terra nullius, or nobody's land. Here across the country, for many thousands of years, was the land occupied by more than 500 Aboriginal groups, each with their own territories, their own languages and customs, a network of relationships between the birds, the animals, vegetation, rocks, waterholes and people. Our ancient continent is home to some of the oldest and most prolific collections of rock art in the world. There are hundreds of sites, many of which are only known to the Aborigines. At the Narwalla Gabamang rock shelter in Arnhem Land, fragments from a charcoal drawing have been dated at 28,000 years old. Others are more recent, being about 1,000 years old. At Marajooga on the Burrup Peninsula in WA, recently nominated for World Heritage Listing, are one of the world's largest collections of rock carvings, which are up to 20,000 years old. From this area in the Dampier archipelago, the photo on screen shows the extraordinary etching in stone of the Tasmania tiger, which has been extinct across Australia's mainland for millennia. The map of Indigenous Australia showed that before 1829, Perth was part of the Whadjuk territory occupied by the Aboriginal people known as Noongar, which means person or man. The Noongar of the Swan and Canning rivers were divided into different groups. There are 14 languages of the Noongar people. Each group had its own identified territory and held specific cultural and hunting rights over particular stretches of the country. These territory rights were inherited through complex kinship systems. The Noongars believed the rainbow serpent called the Woggle was responsible for creating the waterways and landforms around Perth. Shown on the screen are the Whadjuk tribal territories on the Swan and Canning rivers, as the Noongar called Yagan, described them to Robert Lyon in 1832. In these early years of colonial settlement, Yagan killed a white man in retaliation for a fellow Noongar being shot dead. In 1833, Yagan, aged about 38, was killed and his head removed and sent to London. In 1834, there was the massacre at Pinjarra of between 15 to 80 Aborigines who were at their camping grounds on the banks of the Murray River. Yagan became a symbol of the unjust and sometimes brutal treatment of the Indigenous people by colonial settlers. Today he is remembered with a statue of him which stands on Harrison Island, as well as the naming of the Yagan Square in the city and Yagan Reserve at Bull Creek. For those interested in learning more about Perth's Aboriginal past, I recommend the Go Cultural website, which gives details of various tours, including an informative 1.5-hour walking tour around Elizabeth Quay, where your host and guide is Walter Maguire, a well-respected Noongar man who is a descendant of several Aboriginal tribal clans of the southwest of WA. To end part 2 of today's talk regarding Aborigines, I'd be remiss not to mention some of the many adverse consequences of European settlement since 1788. Conflict developed over land. The Aboriginal people accepted that different groups had rights to different territory. The Europeans, by contrast, treated all of the land as entirely their own. As an example, in 1817, whites discovered that Tasmanian lands were very suitable for raising sheep. From 1819, the British government took, without treaty or payment, huge amounts of Tasmanian land that had been used by the Aborigines as traditional kangaroo hunting grounds. In 1826, the British Governor George Arthur declared colonists were free to kill Aborigines when they attacked settlers or their property. In 1829, there were only a few hundred surviving Aboriginals. 1876 saw the death of Truganini, the last full-blooded Aboriginal Tasmanian. The experience in Queensland was another tragedy. From the first penal settlement of Moreton Bay in 1824, as white pastoralists moved into new parts of country, violence followed. With the set-up of a native police force, a conservative estimate is that 24,000 Aborigines were killed by these parastatal militias. Timothy Bottoms put the combined death total in Queensland from native police and private killing operations at close to 50,000. The worst impact of European settlement came from germs, such as smallpox and influenza. Records show from 1788 the Aboriginal population declined by at least 80%. Within 1 century of European colonisation, over 60,000 years of Aboriginal traditions had been largely swept away. The plight of Aborigines has been a complex one and cannot be adequately described in today's short talk. The wrongs have been many and are typified by the 1901 Australian Constitution, which denied citizenship to Aboriginal people. In 1992, in the Mabo case, the High Court of Australia recognised native title for the first time. Then significantly in 2008, the federal government apologised to the stolen generations of an estimated 20,000 plus children who were forcibly removed from their families on the basis of their race. 220 years after the unfolding impact of the first fleet arrived in Port Jackson in 2008, it was long overdue for us to say we are sorry. Following the Uluru Statement in 2017, the next hurdle will this year be deciding whether to give Indigenous Australians a voice to Parliament. In part 3 of today's talk, we go back to the time when Europeans began to explore the world by boat. Planting ideas for exploration was Greek philosopher Aristotle, who more than 2,300 years ago invented the concept of terra australis incognita, translated as the unknown Southland. Aristotle thought that the massive land in the northern hemisphere must be counterbalanced by a massive land in the south. In about 150 AD, the Egyptian astronomer Ptolemy popularised Aristotle's vision by drawing a map of the world, complete with a big lumpy southern continent that he'd completely made up. Ptolemy had made terra australis a lure in the minds of future explorers. Almost 2,000 years after the life of Aristotle, European boats started arriving in the great southern land. After the Aborigines arrived some 650 centuries ago, it's only been in the last 4 centuries that the next explorers have been confirmed to have arrived. Contentious claims are that the admirals of Chinese Zheng He arrived on Australian coasts in 1421. Professor Armesto from University of London puts the claim in context by commenting, "To say that it is devoid of evidence, logic, scholarship and sense was just about the nicest thing one could say about it." Some respectable historians contend that the Portuguese sailor Cristóvão de Mendonça explored the east coast of Australia in 1522. Similar to the comments of Professor Armesto, historian David Hunt comments, "We know Cristóvão discovered Australia because in the mid-1500s, some French guys from Dieppe copied Portuguese maps and drew something that looks awfully like Eastern Australia, albeit if you've had a lot to drink and have never seen an atlas before." The first undisputed European arrival in Australia was 223 years before 1829, being in 1606 when William Janszoon, a captain in the spice trade VOC, also known as the Dutch East India Company, landed his boat in the Duiven near Weipa on the west side of the Cape York Peninsula. Given the remote location, it's not surprising that Janszoon was unaware he discovered a new continent. He thought the land was an extension of the New Guinea coast. Also, in 1606, Spanish sailor de Torres sailed through the strait that now bears his name. 9 millennia earlier, this would not have been possible as the strait was devoid of water, being a land bridge at the end of the last ice age between Australia and Papua New Guinea. The Spanish were to keep the secret of the strait for more than the next 150 years. In 1611, Dutchman Hendrik Brewer discovered that sailing from Cape of Good Hope to Batavia was much quicker if the roaring 40 winds were used across the Indian Ocean. The problem with the route was that it was difficult to determine longitude, making landfalls on the WA coast more likely. In 1616, Dutchman Dirk Hartog appears to be the first European to land in WA, famously nailing his pewter plate to a post in Shark Bay. Hartog's discovery was to have a major impact. What had been a mythical continent known as Terra Australis Incognita began to appear on European maps bearing the name of Hartog's ship, Land van der Ontrocht, Land of Ontrocht. In 1619, the Dutch Frederik de Houtman in the Dordrecht and Jacob de Edel in the Amsterdam sighted land near present-day Perth, which they called the Edelsland, then headed north for Batavia, now called Jakarta in Indonesia. In 1622, English Captain John Brooks wrecked his boat Trial on rocks about 100 kilometres off the northwest cape of Australia. But one could hardly call this an English discovery of the great southern land. In 1627, Dutchman Francois Thyssen in the boat Gulden Zippard reached Cape Leeuwin, sailed along the southern Australian coast to present-day Ceduna, then back along the WA coast to Batavia. And in 1629, the Dutch boat Batavia was infamously wrecked on the Abrolhos Islands. Mutineers slaughtered over 120 men, women, children and babies. The psychopath leader, Cornelis, was tried, found guilty, and had both his hands cut off before being hanged along with half a dozen of his men. Yes, this was a truly tragic story with a very gruesome end. The 1629 wreck of the Batavia was found in 1963, with excavations commencing in 1972. A skeleton, salvaged timbers, a stone portico, cannon, anchors, coins and other artefacts can today be found at the WA Maritime Museum in Fremantle. For many years I thought the stone portico was that which had been carried by the Batavia. It is in fact a replica. The original stone portico is in the Geraldton Museum, together with impressive displays on other Dutch ships, which during several centuries have bumped into our coastline. In 1642, another Dutchman, Abel Tasman, found and formally claimed Van Diemen's Land, which he named after the Dutch East Indies governor of Batavia, the place today called Jakarta. This was a fact conveniently overlooked by British settlers a century and a half later. 214 years after Tasman's voyage, in 1856 the British changed the name of the island to Tasmania in honour of its European discoverer. As a result of his second voyage in 1644, although the coastline of the continent had still not been fully explored, the name New Holland was first applied by Abel Tasman. The name Australia would be adopted 180 years later. In 1688, William Dampier, on one of his 3 circumnavigations of the globe, became the first recording Englishman to reach the Australian mainland by arriving north of Broome in his boat the Cygnet. Today the area is called the Dampier Peninsula. In 1699, Dampier returned to New Holland on the Roebuck, which passed Cartog Island and spent 2 weeks exploring Shark Bay. Heading north along the coast for 1,000 kilometres, he then found a group of islands now known as the Dampier Archipelago near Karratha. Interesting to note that Dampier's account of a voyage to New Holland was a literary success, and whilst I'm not sure whether he found the dinosaur footprints on the Kimberley coast, apparently his account inspired Jonathan Swift's Gulliver Travels, with tales of little people and giants. In 1697, Dutchman Willem de Vlaming and his crew are believed to be the first Europeans to arrive and venture up Perth's Swan River and see black swans. Statues of de Vlaming and a black swan can today be seen on the banks of the river, very near the Crown Casino. Whilst I've been telling you about European boat arrivals, we should not forget that during the 1600s, traders from Indonesia were regularly sailing their boats along the North Australian coast to fish for turtle and harvest sea cucumbers, which are regarded as a delicacy and an aphrodisiac by many Chinese. On the screen are a couple of early maps which I thought of interest. The chart on the left, dated 1628, is by Dutch East India Company cartographer Hessel Gerrits, showing Dutch discoveries around the western and southern coasts of Australia. I've enlarged the names Land van Dordrecht from Dirk Hartog's arrival in 1616 and the name de Edelsland from the voyage in 1619 when the coast near Perth was sighted. The other chart dates from half a century later in 1663 and shows that Terra Austral, the land south, includes Hollandia Nova, being Australia, Terra de Demons, being Tasmania, and Nova Zealandia, being New Zealand. Critically missing is a map of the east coast of Australia. In the first of 3 impressive world voyages, it was the great navigator and Englishman Captain James Cook who, after charting New Zealand, first charted the east coast of New Holland. It was in the boat Endeavour that on 20th of April 1770, Lieutenant Zachary Hicks is credited as the first to sight and discover the east coast at a place now called Point Hicks. After an impressionable stop at Botany Bay, on 22nd of August 1770, Cook reached the far north tip of Queensland, where at Possession Island in the Torres Strait, he claimed eastern Australia for Great Britain. He named the land New Wales, which was then revised to New South Wales. Captain James Cook is now considered the greatest navigator of his era, being the equal of Portuguese Vasco da Gama, first European to reach India by sea, 1497 to 1499, and Portuguese Ferdinand Magellan, first to lead a circumnavigation of the Earth, 1519 to 1522. And for any Star Trek fans in the audience, it's interesting to note that the first name of Captain Cook inspired the first name of Captain James Kirk, who with his crew in the Starship Enterprise would boldly go where no man has gone before. Here's some interesting history on two French boat arrivals, not generally well known, as it's been the English who have taught the history in our schools. In 1772, Frenchman Marion de Fresnay led the French in the boats Mascarin and the Marquis de Castries and became the first European on Van Diemen's Land since Abel Tasman 130 years before. He claimed the country for France, but the French did not establish any settlement there to protect their new territory. De Fresnay is believed to have been the first European to make contact with the Tasmanian Aboriginals. Tasmania was not terra nullius, or nobody's land. Also in that same year, 4,000 kilometres to the west, another Frenchman, Louis Saint-Alois, in the boat Gros Ventre, reached Cape Leeuwin and sailed north to Shark Bay. On 30th of March 1772, on De Cartog Island, he claimed ownership of the coast of West Australia on behalf of King Louis XV of France. It was the same land that the Dutch had claimed 156 years earlier in 1616. As with Tasmania, the French claim over Western Australia was never secured by a permanent settlement. On 4th of July 1776, the American colonies, at war with Great Britain, adopted the Declaration of Independence, which announced a new nation no longer under British rule. Americans refused to import the convicts that Britain had been dumping on them. Britain needed to find another location. After years of deliberations on different locations, influenced by the experience of Cook's expedition and recommendations from the botanist Joseph Banks, in 1788, under the command of Arthur Phillip, a fleet of 11 British ships survived the 8-month extraordinary voyage of more than 25,000 kilometres from Portsmouth to arrive in Botany Bay. There were about 1,500 who landed, of whom 754 were convicts. The next 80 years would see about 164,000 convicts dispatched from Great Britain to New South Wales and to other Australian colonies in Tasmania, Queensland, Victoria, and of course Western Australia. It wasn't too long before it would be understandable for any Aborigine, if given a can of British paints, to write the message, "Turn back the boats." In January 1788, also arriving in Botany Bay within a week after the British, were two French exploration ships, the Astrolabe and the Bassoul, commanded by Captain La Perouse. After meeting with the English, in March the French quietly left Botany Bay. The two French ships then went missing. In 1792, a French expedition led by Antoine Bruni d'Entrecasteaux arrived in Van Diemen's Land, then sailed up the east coast of the Pacific Islands to try and establish what had happened to La Perouse and his ships. Nothing could be found. It was not until 1827 that remnants of the ships were found in the Solomon Islands. The wreck of the Astrolabe was identified in 1959 and that of the Bassoul in 1964. The visit by the French is remembered today at the La Perouse Museum and in the naming of the suburb La Perouse at the north entrance to Botany Bay. As just mentioned, the French sent Entrecasteaux to look for the lost La Perouse. His mission in two ships, La Recherche and L'Espérance, also included charting the south coast of New Holland. In 1792, the expedition spent 5 weeks on Van Diemen's Land. After finding no trace of the La Perouse ships, Astrolabe Orbisul in the Pacific from Timor, Andre Cousteau sailed south and east back to Van Diemen's Land, being the first to sail completely around Australia, a decade before Matthew Flinders. En route, anchorage was found in a bay he named Esperance, after their ship L'Espérance, meaning hope. The numerous nearby islands were given the name de Andre Cousteau Islands, which was later changed to the Recherche archipelago, named after the other boat. Also in the 1790s, 3 years after first settlement, the British Royal Navy gave George Vancouver command of 2 ships, HMS Discovery and HMS Chatham, on an expedition charged with exploring the Pacific region. Vancouver had previously served as a midshipman with James Cook. After crossing the Indian Ocean, in 1791, Captain Vancouver formally claimed for the British a possession point, King George Sound in WA, being where Albany is today. He then went on to explore and chart North America's northwestern Pacific coast regions. In Canada, the city of Vancouver is named after him. About a decade later, the French were back in the waters of Nouvelle Holland. In an expedition approved by Napoleon Bonaparte, 2 ships, geograph captained by Nicolas Baudin and naturalist captained by Jacques Hamelin, set off to the Great Southern Land on a mission for the purpose of observation and research relating to geography and natural history. The expedition consisted of 24 various scientists and artists. The coast of WA was examined first. In June 1801, the naturalists stopped and explored the Rivière des Cygnes, now the Swan River. An extensive chart was made, as shown on the slide, of the terrain from Fremantle up to beyond Guildford to Henley Brook. The chart was prepared by Francois-Antoine Harrison, after who was named the island beside today's causeway. Near the causeway is a bust of the expedition leader Nicolas Baudin. The large, long-billed black cockatoo found in the southwest and sighted by the French in Geographe Bay is now named Baudin's black cockatoo in recognition of the French explorer. Many names on the WA coast are thanks to the French expedition, including Jurien Bay, after Charles de Jurien, commander of the French Navy. Lancelin, after P.F. Lancelin, author of the World Map of Sciences. Point Perrin, after Francis Perrin, zoologist on the Natural East. Cape Bouvard, after Alexis Bouvard, French astronomer. Vasse Estuary River, after Timothy Vasse, seaman who was lost overboard. Cape Freycinet, after the 2 Freycinet brothers who were on the voyage. In 1811, one of the Freycinet brothers, Louis Claude, published the first full map of Nouvelle Holland, where it was interesting to note part of the southern coast from Ceduna and past Adelaide to Melbourne being called Terra Napoleon. In South Australia, today's Spencer Gulf was called Gulf Bonaparte, and neighbouring St Vincent's Gulf was called Gulf Josephine. Louis Freycinet returned to Australia as part of a 4-year world trip from 1817 to 1820. Understandably, the British were getting more suspicious about French intentions. Regarding the black cockatoo named after Nicolas Baudin, here in 2018 is the front page of the Southern Gazette, which features Baudin's cockatoo Pepe, one of 2 hand-raised black cockatoos that the Perth Zoo used to educate the public about birds. Competing with the French in their mapping of Australia's coastline was Captain Matthew Flinders from the British Royal Navy. In his boat, HMS Investigator, Flinders, aged only in his late 20s, is attributed as the first circumnavigation from 1801 to 1803 and identified the land girt by sea as a continent. Previously in 1798 with George Bass, he'd proved that Tasmania was not joined to the mainland. In his voyage that circumnavigated the continent, he removed speculation that there might have been a strait that separated the landmass at New Holland in the west and New South Wales in the east. In April 1802, at a place named by Flinders as Encounter Bay, just south of Adelaide, a place I've just recently visited, the British and French completing the circumnavigation in December 1803, Flinders en route back to England was detained at French-controlled Ile-de-France, now known as Mauritius. From 1803, Britain had declared war on France, which continued until the Treaty of Fontainebleau in 1814. Although under detention, Flinders was permitted to send to England in 1804 a map where he used the name Australia, being his suggestion to Admiralty for replacing the name New Holland. Following his release in 1810, in 1814, 3 years after the French map of Australia, Flinders was finally able to publish his book, A Voyage to Terra Australis, including an atlas of his maps. He died prematurely at the age of 40 in 1814. In 1824, more than 2,100 years after the name invented by Aristotle, the British government approved the name Australia. Interesting that the portrait shown of Matthew Flinders was painted when he was in detention on Mauritius. In 1987, the portrait was purchased by Alan Bond for more than $1 million. Before Bond's empire collapsed, the painting vanished in Bond's private jet to Switzerland. It was later discovered in a London warehouse, then apparently purchased for $780,000 and gifted in 2000 to the Art Gallery of South Australia by David Roche. It was great to see it in Adelaide recently. Here's the photo I took on 8th of March of the plaque commemorating the meeting nearby in Encounter Bay between Flinders and Baudin on 8th of April 1802. Not to be forgotten in the pages of Antipodean history is Trim, the first cat to circumnavigate Australia, with his master Matthew Flinders. Now quite famous, a statue tribute of Trim can be found outside the State Library of New South Wales in Macquarie Street in Sydney. I've been astonished to discover that there are well over 1,400 shipwrecks along the WA coast. Before 1829, here's a list for at least 11 wrecks, 6 of which are Dutch, 3 English, 1 Portuguese and 1 American. Already today we've talked about the wrecks of the Triel in 1622 and the Batavia in 1629. Others include the Dutch Sightdorp, whose cargo of freshly minted silver coins was lost in 1712, but found by divers more than 250 years later in the 1960s. The American boat the Rapid, en route to Canton in China, was wrecked in 1811 with a cargo of 280,000 Spanish silver dollars, most of which was salvaged at the time. Following the discovery of the wreck in 1978, the WA Maritime Museum now have custody of 18,548 of the coins. Another wreck of interest includes the English whaling boat called Lively, which in about 1807 came to grief on the Mermaid Reef of the Rolly Shoals. This is in the context that since about 1792, whaling boats have been operating off the WA coast, particularly down south around King George Sound, by the British, the French and the Americans. With the French still having territory ambitions in the Southern Hemisphere, in 1826 a British military outpost was founded at Fredericktown, which later was named Albany. The following year, British Captain James Stirling arrived in HMS Success and in 1827 surveyed the Swan River. From this trip we have on screen a painting from Kings Park looking towards the undeveloped South Perth Peninsula. There were no development applications for 30, 40 or 50-storey buildings in those days. With rumours the French were about to establish a penal colony in the western part of Australia, possibly at Shark Bay, the British Colonial Office in 1828 assented to Stirling's proposal for a free settlement in the Swan River area, with himself as its governor. The British didn't want a similar situation like in Canada, which was occupied by both the British and the French. In 1829, Captain Charles Fremantle arrived in his boat HMS Challenger and declared the Swan River colony for Britain. Shortly after, Captain James Stirling arrived in the boat Parmelia and named the new city after Perth, Scotland, being the birthplace and parliamentary seat in the British House of Commons of Sir George Murray, Secretary of State for War and the Colonies. The official foundation ceremony for Perth took place on 12th of August 1829 with the chopping down of a tree, the first cut by Helen Dance, wife of Captain William Dance of HMS Sulphur. In 2019, I travelled to Spain and learnt some more about the history of the famous voyage of Christopher Columbus that was sponsored by Spanish Queen Isabella. What, you may ask, does that have to do with the history of West Australia? Christopher Columbus, as we all know, is credited after the Vikings with the so-called European discovery of the Americas in 1492. It was a time when Spain and Portugal were great maritime rivals. Rodrigo Borgia from Valencia in Spain had just been elected as Pope Alexander VI, having bought his way into the papacy. In an effort to keep the peace, in 1493 the Pope issued a decree called the Inter Cetera, which effectively drew a north-south line down the Atlantic, where lands to the west belonged to Spain and lands to the east belonged to Portugal. Thanks to bias from the Spanish Pope, the line favoured Spanish claim to land in most of the Americas. The line was adjusted in 1494 by the Treaty of Tordesillas. Then in 1529 the Treaty of Saragossa was signed by the Spanish and Portuguese based on a line which wrapped around the world from the one in the Atlantic to define Castilian and Portuguese influences in Asia. The wraparound line ran right across the as yet undiscovered land that would be known as Australia. Following the influential colonial demarcation lines between Spain and Portugal in the 15th and 16th centuries, here, more than 2 centuries later, the unexpected impact and history on the setting of the border between New South Wales and Western Australia. In 1788, Governor Phillip claimed the newly discovered Great Southern Land only as far west as the 135th meridian east, in accordance with his commission. It's been suggested that the 1788 claim by the British of 135 degrees east was in reference to Spain's claims under the Treaty of Tordesillas, the line that wrapped around the world. Spain was seen as no longer having an interest in the area. On the other hand, the other signatories to the treaty, the Portuguese, still had a presence in Macau and East Timor. Adoption of 135 degrees east as a boundary would minimise provocation of the Portuguese. By 1825, Britain was powerful enough and found it convenient to adopt a boundary line with New Holland, further west being the meridian 129 degrees east. In 1829, following the settlement and naming of the Swan River colony in Perth, the boundary with New South Wales was declared to be 129 degrees east. This would become known as the state boundary when in 1832 the name of the Swan River colony was changed to West Australia. Amazing to think this boundary setting had its evolution from the papal line of 1493, which was thanks to the discovery voyages of Christopher Columbus. T.S. Eliot once said, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." I think that is true of the talk today. This evening, we've travelled a large expanse of history, more than 4 billion years, covering ancient Australia, Aborigines and boat arrivals. We've seen the stromatolites of Shark Bay, the giant scorpions clambering ashore along the Murchison River, the dinosaurs walking in the Kimberley, and Australia separating from Antarctica. We've seen the Aborigines arrive about 650 centuries ago, who witnessed Australia's megafauna and large fluctuations in falling and rising sea levels. And we've seen the arrival of the European boats, including those of the Dutch, the French and the British. Hopefully I've revealed some insights into the amazing, very old continent we live on. For this presentation, I have used various sources. In particular, for those interested in ancient Australia, I very highly recommend Australia, The Time Traveller's Guide, being a DVD series of 4 episodes hosted by Dr. Richard Smith, now available for free on YouTube. For those interested in reading more on boat arrivals, I suggest the book Girt, being an informative, amusing and often irreverent history by David Hunt. There is now a sequel called Truegurt. Also the books by David Hill, 1788, The Brutal Truth of the First Fleet and The Great Race. So that's all from me. Thank you for listening.